Dr Bamo Nouri, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So last time you were here, we were talking about Americanism. This time we're talking about diaspora, immigration, sustainability, and much more. So do you want to give everyone a definition of what diaspora is?
Interesting times to be discussing diaspora, to be honest. But diaspora is basically the people who are from a particular place, particular homeland, but they live outside of their homeland. And the conversation really has started to increase and become more prominent in recent times because the world is starting to kind of change and shift in the way we look at society. The key players in society historically was all about, let's all assimilate to a particular model. But now there's great value in that individuality, in those individual cultures, in those individual people.
What is the model that you're referring to?
When you say model, how do you mean?
You said everyone was trying to...
the classic neoliberal, capitalist model where everyone's kind of focused on one particular way of life, diversity, inclusion. These things really weren't part of the bigger conversation. But the more we seem to scratch the surface with diaspora now, we realise, wow, in that diversity and in that migration of people comes so much knowledge, intellect, and ways of life, some of which harbour solutions to actually tackling some of the key issues that the world faces, especially in regards to the climate.
So let's define diaspora for all of those that might not be familiar with that word, because I wasn't that familiar with that word until I started prepping for this podcast. But then I realised actually I am, because I'm not somebody who's from the United Kingdom. I wasn't born here. And in fact, a lot of my surroundings are people who've been impacted by this. So diaspora is the spread of people from their homeland to a foreign country. According to UN national statistics, this was based in 2020. India has the largest amount of people constituted under the label of diaspora with 18 million. Mexico, 11 million. The Russian Federation, 11 also. China, 10 million. And Syria, 8 million. You see some differences there, don't you? You see all types of countries, China, Russia, India, Syria, Mexico, different countries, different geopolitical climates. So what does that tell you about the mass effect of diaspora and the fact that it can be from any country?
The first thing it tells you, the fact that there's so many different key global players, some of the BRIC countries or BRICS countries that you mentioned there, shows that there's value in diaspora, that they bring a hell of a lot in terms of expertise, skills, ways of life to economies. And those subcultures are as integral to society and the political system as the kind of main, let's say, guarding or main functioning philosophy, be it neoliberalism, be it capitalism, be it state-sponsored capitalism, but communism like China's model. It shows that there's great value in it, and it's also something that, as students of international relations, I consider myself one of those, even though I teach it also. It's important to understand those different cultures and the way they operate, the way they embed and assimilate into society, and not just to look at diaspora under the mainstream definition. Diaspora is a very respectful, original, and the way we should look at any other nationality that's outside of their homeland. But in the mainstream, you have the label immigrants. If there's groups of immigrants, you might see in the mainstream media, tabloid media, swarms of immigrants, and that completely takes away their value. It dehumanizes them. And all of that, basically, when you kind of look at this, when we talked about, obviously, the podcast is about sustainability as well. How do we deal with the challenges that society faces? These problems aren't going to be solved by a particular part or aspect of society, i.e. the so-called, natives. I mean, even we talked about America. It was funny because one of my colleagues and I were having a conversation at an American university. It's probably about 5-6 years ago, and she said to me, we both had a class of, it's American university, we had American students, and I was teaching about Americanism at the time, and she said, where were your students mainly from taking that class? I said, they were American natives. What I meant was that they're American citizens. But she turned around and said, no, they're not Native Americans. And it just shows, that society, even when you look at America, you look at the UK, Anglo-Saxons, Celts, there's so many different groups of people that have come and travelled, even in, in the royal family, not just with Meghan, but before, that migration mixing is very, very common, but we've never actually sought to understand it, because to understand and acknowledge it can be disruptive to the existing orders that we have, which are based on, whether you like it or not, a domination of the global north, the so-called, white race countries as in their, tone, versus the global south and then the control of the global south. It's interesting because as we speak now, I just a few days ago was working on a chapter that I have coming out for the Royal Institute of International Affairs, co-authored with Professor Inderjeet Parmar. And what we look at is it's a 100-year review of Chatham House and their achievements and their not so great achievements. One of the things that came up in the 50s and 60s was a major race issue, where when we look at the world of IR as lecturers and professors and researchers, we never really heard about race until the 70s, 80s, until critical theory came out. The whole conversation, even when you look at realism, liberalism, the key mainstream IR theories, there's no mention of race. Yet in the 50s and 60s, in our very own London, there was a massive panic that there's a whole decolonization movement of independent states emerging on the African continent. And for Britain, former colonial Britain, who now has this kind of commonwealth, this was a major concern, because if these independent states align with the communists, it can be a major problem because there's a whole Cold War going on. So race all of a sudden becomes a big hoo-ha and a big panic for the UK government, to the extent where this think tank in London is quickly mobilising funds from America and American counterparts and its American supporters to basically say that, look, we've got a race issue, and if this breaks out, it's going to impact the Cold War, because this particular group of people that we call the minority here in England, they're actually the global majority. And it's interesting because when you think about, coming back to what we talked about with assimilation and fitting into the model, I mean, I don't know how much you read into these things, in your own capacity in architecture, but when you're told that you're the, ethnic minority, or BAME, black and minority, ethnic, you kind of, it brings a connotation and it has like an effect of insignificance on you in this kind of broader picture. But really, you're part of the global majority. And this worry emerged in the 50s and 60s. But what we look at in this chapter is because of Chatham House's power at that particular moment in actually being able to manage the whole legitimacy or legitimating ideology in favour of Anglo-American dominance, that they were able to control this race issue and diffuse it as best as they could so it doesn't reach the mainstream. Because there was a fear that this race thing could become a major threat to this, white dominance, if you like.
That's very interesting. And I had two thoughts. Firstly, I thought to myself, yes, sometimes I do feel like the minority. Yes, sometimes even other people like myself in architecture school, we think to ourselves, are we less likely to get a job than the regular British person? That's an entirely different conversation for another day. But I thought then, as Kurds, Bamo, don't we feel like the minority even back where we're from because of the way our country is divided? It's almost as if it doesn't matter if I'm considered a minority here, because it always feels like that. Whenever I hear about the struggles of Kurdistan, we're always the minority anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know if an Arab person or an African person could answer that question a bit differently.
Yeah.
But as a Kurd, being a minority or being perceived as the minority has become a normality, because truly we're not that few. But our official numbers under this independent area in Iraq makes us look like the minority. So I don't know how you feel about that. Me and you were both born in Slemani, Kurdistan, right?
Yeah.
But coming here, like, it's almost normal, classed as a minority.
It's interesting you say that. But I'll give you a difference between the British and the English education system. So I've taught at American universities before, right?
I was going to ask actually, which American university did you teach at when you were giving that example? Where is that?
That's based, I think it's outside of New York,
Okay.
in America, like a partner institution in London. This, and they have it like in Paris and various, they have like a study abroad program. Very, very interesting conceptualization to kind of just to put into perspective. In America, what they basically do with their students is they give them up to 100% in their grades, even at university. So students expect, the good students, they expect to be getting A's. What's an A? 93 to 100. And then a lot of students, if they're getting less than, 98, 99, 97, they can be very, very upset. Whereas in England, as you very well know yourself, at university level, it's very difficult to get more than like an 83. That's if you've absolutely produced near publishable work.
Yeah.
Normally, if you've done really well, a first class 72, 75. If you've done really well, 78. But even there, if not difficult, if not impossible to achieve sometimes, especially with some particular areas of work. What you have in some education systems of dominant powers, okay, and even successful countries, is that they embed that confidence in their citizens from the get-go through the education system. So if you're constantly getting A's, you probably hear it in films, or like a documentary, so-and-so was a straight A's student. Straight A's doesn't mean much in the UK, but in America, that's like the normality for the average bright student. Straight A's, it's a big part of their confidence booster from the beginning. And then, of course, you go to school, America, and all these hymns that you sing that basically make you feel that you're part of this bigger power, but also you yourself are powerful. Identity. And identity, therefore, is so powerful. Malcolm X said it, if you were told that you never did anything and never achieved anything, then you can never do anything or be anything. And it was so interesting that quote that I just said there, it upset him so much to the extent that he basically started to debunk all of history about eugenics. This idea that Jesus was white, Moses was white, all this business that we hear about, to the point where he comes up with all the scientific facts to say that, look, eugenics says that a white cell can't produce a black cell. So the origins, Adam and Eve, would have had to have been scientifically, based on your own science, they have to have been black. And all these to kind of bring back the importance of race and to kind of shift when you look into scholarship, I kind of mention it in some of my own work, it's a form of social Darwinism. The more white you are, the more advanced. Right you are, and the darker you are, the more inadequate. And I think we talked about, I'm not sure if we talked about it in our last conversation, but you look at how important race was during Britain's kind of colonization of India. When Britain goes to India, there's a lot of resistance from ordinary Indians. What's going on here? We don't agree with this. Just like anywhere, anyone comes to your home and imposes their way, you're going to be upset with it. I mean, you see the hoo-ha with Sharia law and immigration here, or what European immigrants might be bringing to the UK. You see it today. I mean, imagine it back then when it was a foreign thing. When they go, they realise this resistance and they realise they need to find a way to solve this issue of resistance. So what they basically do is they start to produce knowledge and disseminate knowledge to affirm the white man's burden, and also to get troops from back home to go there in the first place. That we as the civilized world, you may have heard that many times, the civilized world, associating that or connotating that with being white. And they were producing some of maybe you can edit it out and put it in the podcast, the pictures of the Pears soap adverts in India of a baby a brown baby or a black baby being unhappy and sad at being black, and then using this British pear soap where his skin has now gone white where he's used it, and now he's a happy baby. This was used during that period, and this pear soap adverts, they're everywhere. And it said in the text, I can't remember it word for word, but it's things like, we're brightening the dark corners of the globe. From that moment, from Britain's colonization of India and other parts of, obviously, the African continent, you saw this knowledge appear. And you have to debunk all knowledge. You have to always seek to decolonize and really think, how do I know what I know? And where has it come from and how true is it? And I'll come back to the cigarette adverts as well in this country at one point. When that came out, there was then an association with being fair-skinned. I mean, as a Kurdish person, you're fair-skinned. You probably get a lot of extra love just because you're fair-skinned, because being fair-skinned is associated with having a very, very bright future, being beautiful. And I remember when my own sister was born, my granddad was absolutely over the moon. He was quite a dark-skinned person. I didn't know what was going on. This is quite weird. He's not given this level of love. I was born quite fair-skinned, but I hadn't seen the love he'd given to me. So when I saw it with my sister, and some of the stuff that he'd say, and even his own life decisions to marry my grandma, based on that, having fairer skin, it started a knowledge and a knowledge that continued to kind of spread, that the whiter you are, the more successful you're going to be in life. And even the white person or the fairer skinned person being more trusted. And this is the legacy that remains today, to the point where you have bleach being used in those parts of the world. But it's also a form of domination. And I remember I was at One Young World. I was kind of seeing all of the power, the different backgrounds of the world. So you got 200 nation states representatives there, and you see the power in every race and every peoples and populations. And one of the things was, I then kind of reflected with a few friends from back home who had been to similar kind of conferences. I just started to say, why do we not live in a world where we view everyone's value as equal? And one of my friends shared a story of, they went into a room, and they described that when they went into the room, and this is a very educated individual, when they went into the room, and it's a room of all equally important people, when they went into the room, they immediately gravitated towards the white person in the room, and also took more from the little snippets that they said in that room, in this important meeting, than the other counterparts. And they only started to kind of debunk that and decipher what had happened in that moment and deconstruct it, to realize that we have biases of value through these disseminations of knowledge that we've had in the way we look at the world and people. And the knowledge that we value. Of course, critical theory changed that. My book is a critical perspective on the Iraq War that the majority of the guys from Washington or London weren't touching upon. But the more I engage with critical theory, I realize that, wow, knowledge production and these political systems that we have continue to produce the same orders, because the lens is cyclical. It will produce what it knows until we ask those questions and we highlight these things.
That's a very interesting point. And it becomes a socially constructed unconscious bias.
Yeah.
And you're right, in many countries all over the world, they do still bleach their skin. They do still think the Western powers are, superior. That's what China's trying to kind of debunk by sending their students all over the world to do well, having that soft power. So in geopolitics, you have that hard power and that soft power. Hard power is troops on the ground, and soft power is ideology and how you spread it. So America being number one, America winning the race to the moon, all of these things kind of highlight America as being the greatest nation in the world, and whether or not it isn't the debate for this podcast. And it's also the media, the idea that American media is the most powerful media. It does seem like the type of, for good or for worse, the type of social changes that come out of America then fuel everyone else. So a good example of that would be critical race theory, which I'm pretty sure came out of America, right? It would be all of the riots against police brutality, which did exist in other countries, but really have been spearheaded by American campaigners for decades now, as recently as the issues with George Floyd. Going back to your experiences with foreigners that you've met that weren't from the UK, were they all like this? Were they all definitely Western-centric and did think that the Westerners were better than themselves even? Because here we have it, but like you said, we also have it through education. So the Western curriculum in the UK has often been criticised for being, for, what's that line? J. Cole actually says this, they whiten out their own lies or their own crimes.
Yeah.
We know that about England, but the foreigners that you meet that aren't from England, do they feel the same way?
That aren't from England?
Yes.
I would say that everything that we've kind of touched upon today, and everything, all the feelings and the emotions and the ingrained feelings, you'll find commonalities across Europe, across North America, some places in the far, far east, Australia.
But I just want to make a point. It's a question more than anything else. Do you think China would be like that? Because China's kind of like Chinese superiority, Chinese excellence. Have you met Chinese people who've had the same ideology?
The same ideology as like an American?
Yes.
Yeah. No. The different systems raise you in different ways. So a Chinese person, even most of the Far East, let's say, countries, Japan, similar, South Korea, North Korea, these countries, their system of education, they're a lot more humble. It's part of the culture. It's not a brag and boast society, similar to the Middle East, really, although we do have a lot of arrogance in the Middle East, and coupled with ignorance as well, sadly. But there's a lot more discipline in those cultures and more of a, I'd say, reality check and more of an understanding of the world and deeper contextualized understanding the average American. Because when I've had American students, for example, until they've come to the UK to study, they say themselves, and I always ask them, what's your experience of London? And I have a lot of American friends who've come over to live in the UK because once they broke out of that bubble, they actually realised that there's a whole world out there that's so enjoyable, to the point where even though, let's say, London might be the centre of knife crime in Europe or whatever for numbers and stats, they feel safer in London.
There was a mass shooting just a few days ago in Los Angeles. The reason why I asked you about China was because, from my understanding, I know China's not like that. I know China doesn't really look at America and think that it's inferior to it. If China can have that mentality and still teach its people that they have excellence that can match anybody, why do countries like India, which are practically its neighbours, or even countries in the Middle East, fall into the ideology of white supremacy?
It's a very, very good question. The way systems operate, let's say in China, are completely different. The way they shape the mindsets of their citizens is a lot more hands-on and therefore completely different, let's say, to what happens in India or to the Middle East or even in Iraq.
India has a lot of success in the education field.
Not for all of its citizens. There's a big divide in class. So
that's true.
If you're not part of there's a lot of illiteracy, there's a lot of famine, a lot of poverty, which then prevents the education system disseminating. But then you look at other parts of the Middle East, and there are, through successful education systems, for example, Qatar, where the World Cup was held, the UAE for a long time now has been creating and producing individuals in its own country of very, very high caliber to now be competing in various fields that America has been dominating. And when I say compete, I don't mean with the aim to take over American prowess, but to be competing basically is a big place to be in itself. But these are countries that have great education systems. What do I mean by great education system? Great primary and secondary education systems, and also a government-backed system that sends their students to the highest-ranking universities in the world. Have you ever met somebody from the UAE or from Qatar or from Kuwait, okay, all excellent parts of the world, with great education systems that are past university age and they're living here? No. Or in Europe? Never, okay? Almost impossible. Why? Because their country gives them all of the provisions that they need to do that. China's a lot more strict in the sense that it is very, very serving to elite groups, but ordinary citizens too can mobilize and function, albeit in a system that we wouldn't agree with, because they have their own surveillance state and socially controlled system. But to see any country, which I think you brought a question, match America's level of self-belief on an individual level. And I'd ask American students in all my classes, how do you feel when you're in London? Like, do you feel, because when you go on holiday, for example, you always hear that arrogance from an American. In New York, I'm from New York. And when they say where they're from, they don't even say I'm American. They just say their city and state, and there's an expectation for that other person to know. Whereas if that was a person from China or a person from somewhere in the Middle East, they wouldn't have that confidence. They'd say the country, and if they were lucky enough that the person even knew where that was, then they'd say, they might have a follow-up question. But no, some education systems, they start you very, very early on, and you kind of have that sense of confidence linked to your race, linked to your identity, linked to your country, and it's nationalism with a major undercurrent of race playing a big part as well. To the point where, as I said, when you get Americans that come to London and travel to Europe and they see the rest of the world, they have they actually realise that there's a whole outside of the bubble that they haven't seen or experienced.
Yeah, I suppose it would be easy for Americans to be in a bubble, considering how big America is, considering how many people there are, and considering that, maybe they do believe their own hype. I think it is kind of believing his own hype, but if I had to ask you, name the top 5 most famous people, you'd probably, all 5 of them might be American, wouldn't they? So America, for good or for worse, has really played an impactful role in society in good ways and in bad ways. So I don't know, if I mentioned serial killers, you'd probably say Ted Bundy, and he's American. If I mentioned great people who've made change, you might say Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. It's always been the centre of the world. Now, I have a question for you as someone who's a lecturer in international relations. How is America dealing with the competition coming out of the Middle East, of the East, in places like China and India? And how is it trying to adapt itself or try keeping itself at number 1? Because the political landscape looks to me as if China, India, Russia, they're gunning for that top spot.
So under Trump, we saw a managed, aggressive policy that saw American influence and authority, simply put, decline in various parts of the world. So the Far East, the Middle East was a major area of retreat.
That trading war with China that they had.
Yep. The trading war, and that popularity waned there, even though America and China are very interdependent. But I think when you look at regional power globally for the US, Middle East being a key example, that's a big area of the world with important resources. When Biden came in, he was almost playing like second or third best to other regional and global powers in that regard. Then that kind of shows that America now is not just competing on the international stage because of certain things that have happened, but also the bigger kind of picture is that this neoliberal Anglo-American or American-dominated model isn't as powerful as workable as it was before. It's not as powerful now because you live in a multipolar world where you have Brazil, Russia, India, China, etc. And at the same time, you've got all these different ideas of how the world should be, with sustainability now being a big challenge to the whole, picture of what is success. Success is, sleeping on a bed of dollars. Doesn't matter how you've got this, bed of dollars, or you've made all this money, but success is basically capital, big houses, mansions, MTV cribs. Our definitions of success have changed. The pandemic has also exacerbated some of these shifts to the point where we now have alternative powers that are kind of determining the way, or alternative ways that the world should work and operate and could work and operate. For example, we no longer live in a world where it's just the American or the classic neoliberal way of life. There's other elements of society that we need to learn from urgently. Diaspora is a big part of it, but look at the other races, look at the other countries. This World Cup that just went, Qatar. This is probably the most underdocumented World Cup in terms of events outside of the actual football itself. 0 hate crimes, 0 arrests. To have a World Cup where not a single England fan was arrested. God forbid if there were, they would have been all over the media. Yeah, to have a system in place where there's representatives from various countries as workers on the street helping people get by, free SIM cards, international calls, free transport for people, all these kind of things, unheard of hospitality. And then you look at the UAE, this kind of zero crime mindset and mentality, and you compare it to the civilized world, or the so-called civilized world. And you could also say that, coming back to the whole diaspora argument, we've overlooked the contributions of key pillars and members of our societies and what they could bring, or how we could learn from them and their ways and where they've come from. But most importantly, we're now seeing a shift. Is this going to be the East's moment in the next, let's say, or in the rest of this century? For example, Qatar's just demonstrably ran probably the most successful World Cup on goals scored alone, the highest number of goals.
It's very
scored.
Entertaining.
Yeah, very, very entertaining.
It will always be the World Cup that Messi won.
Yeah, exactly. And that alone was the pinnacle, right? Wherever Messi wins, nobody will forget that.
Yeah.
It was almost written in the stars, right? That's kind of one element. Saudi Arabia's got its, you're an architect. I don't know how this
the
will
line.
plan out. Yeah, the line. They always say the architect is the kind of first base of the plan, but it's always the engineers that have to get everything right. But of course, if the architect is slightly messed up, and I've heard some stories from my sister, stories that she tells me. So Saudi Arabia's moment, the UAE has already been doing great things. Their people believe that they are the best. They've got that mindset almost, but without the arrogance. The American great mindset, but with loads of humbleness and actually giving back to their regions. If you look at the pandemic, that's a big indication. And then you can compare that, how things are in Europe, how things are in the UK, cost of
we're
inflation.
going through it.
Yeah. America, similar. We may see a turn of the tide because the models that we've been given to be told that they're the best models have alienated. You said, how do other people feel in other societies? That inadequacy or inferiority complex that comes with this powerful system that tells you that, you all need to fit a particular order, which overlooks key contributions from an Iraqi Kurd, from a South African, from a, let's say, person from China in that very, very system. Because our systems, if you think about it, they don't really consolidate the people we have. It's more a case of the people have to consolidate whatever is needed for that particular political system and then serve it. That might be takeaways, that might be cleaning services, that might be bus drivers, that might be, whatever's needed and whatever we can break into. But that complex, that lack of consolidation from the beginning has a detrimental effect for society's capabilities. So you're a kid and you, as a diaspora, never are made to fit in that particular country that you're in, far away from home. You never know your value. You never know your own history, and you're caught between where you're from and the culture at home, which if you have first generation migrant parents, they've already had a rupture. They've left their homeland. So they're kind of, when you have that rupture where you have to leave for political reason, insecurity, that never leaves you. You never feel secure. So you go home to that. You're in school, you're not really consolidated. That affects your trajectory into university education, where then you may only hang around with people that you think you have things in common with, i.e. people of the non-white race. And you see those groups and hurdles in universities. I mean, whoever's watching this can go to a university and look at how different groups come together. But for society, it's disastrous because contributions of key people of different backgrounds are missed out because the system doesn't have a way of capturing those or utilizing them. And you then create unequal societies. The cycle continues. And then when we face problems, because there's only a dominant group in society that have been the ones to dominate in terms of decision making and strategies and directions, then we're very, very short in finding solutions and workable ways. You look at, what if we had a more inclusive society and we incorporated all these diverse cultures, backgrounds, and ways of looking at things? How richer our societies would be in solutions. And I'll come back to One Young World and climate change very, very quickly as an example. So we're at this One Young World conference, former world leaders, former presidents, big CEOs, companies.
I wonder how much they get paid to be there, by the way.
You know what? I can't say anything negative about One Young World simply because of the indelible feeling it left on me.
I'm just curious.
And it's interesting that you asked that question, because when I saw corporations there, the first thing I thought, this is some hardcore whitewashing. But then you kind of look deeper and you realize that there was a shift taking place, a powerful shift.
But there has to be, because society now is under the radar through social media, through the camera lens.
Yeah. That as well, which we should definitely come on to. But what I loved is you've got all these experts, scientists, big corporates. The corporations have the power to dedicate their money to research that can be groundbreaking, unbelievable solutions. Problems that we're going to continue to face if we don't, they're going to continue to exacerbate. And one of the beautiful things was this lady from Ecuador came up. She couldn't speak English. She had a translator from like a rural village, the kind of limited resources, limited infrastructure. But her and her community were finding natural solutions to climate change and adapting to the challenges of climate change better than we are dealing with climate change, with all of our scientists, experts, corporate power, finance, money, resources, and mobilization of people. What does that tell you? That tells you that there's great value in different cultures and different communities, and that this system that we've had, which maybe this would be the point to conclude about the system as much, the system that we've had up to now, which is all about this economic model and capitalism and neoliberalism, it doesn't work, and it's consuming the planet. The planet is basically consumed by consumption. And that one example at One Young World, that was like a light bulb moment. Wow. When it comes to diaspora, we've overlooked so many contributions and ways. Imagine those mothers of those children that have come from different countries, the value their skills and their knowledge could bring to those communities and to countries where they live, especially in challenging times, and even directions for the future, because you learn from different cultures, you learn from each other's differences. It's one of God's gifts that we have. So far it's been overlooked, and that alone tells you that we're seeing a major shift.
Subconsciously, is it just normal to want to flock with your own group? Because as soon as you talked about groups in universities getting together based on their similarities, I thought about high school first and foremost. As you know, I'm from Manchester, and you couldn't really ask for a more mixed society, especially where I live, being from Marseille, going to a high school in Cholton. This was a very mixed place, and yet I still remember, for example, I always hung out over the bridge, but then there would be groups of different, not just ethnic minorities, but even just groups. That always made me think, is it sociological or is it a social construct? Because, I say this because in Manchester, we're all mixed. We all meet. By the time you're 18, you've probably made friends with people from like 10 different countries. So it's not racism, but sociologically, we still flock together because of those similarities. Even marriages, I mean, interracial marriages are going up. However, especially from ethnic backgrounds, still tend to marry within their own race. So the question is, and it could be both of these two things, is it subconscious and sociological, or is it a backlash of previous lessons that were taught to us, so therefore we still don't mix as much as we should?
I think it's both, one as a result of the other. I have kids, and when I take kids, let's say, kids examples at school, and kids also when I take them to, Disneyland or play places, play centres, what do? They play with anybody and everybody.
I was going to ask that actually.
You know, and then you realise that this construct is such a construct, but constructs are ideas or ideologies, and ideologies are lenses, and lenses will continue to produce the same outcomes as per the theoretical grounding of that lens. So if that particular construct sees, races as different or differentiates them, then that will continue to produce that in the societies where this is dominant. So at a very, very young school level, early school level, you don't have that. But then by the time you go to university, the class-based differences that we see around kind of race and gender and all this, they start to kind of slowly emerge. The boys might flock together, the girls might flock together in some areas, and particular races more dominantly is what we see come together.
There's also a lot of international students as well. And from my experience, it's not that they don't want to hang around with the rest of us that are nationals in England. It's just that there's a language barrier, they're more comfortable amongst each other, they're more culturally astute with one another. So it's definitely more than just the lens that society is putting in front of us to look through. I can't help but to think it's also sociological. But your point was very interesting. Young kids don't see any of that.
No.
It's genuinely amazing. Because the example I gave was high school, and these are early teenage years. And I'm telling you right now, Bamo, there were many, many different groups. That's not to say they didn't mix with each other, but even from a young age. But do you think that also happens in an ethnic household where they'll say, "I'll hang out with this kid and that kid"?
For sure.
Religion might play a part in.
Sure. Look, that knowledge, so and so a race is different, or so and so a culture is different,
and we can't be like them.
Or to simply put it, the proper term is otherization. That exists both ways. There's otherization of they're different, we're different, in, let's say, the dominant particular culture or the so-called natives, but you also have that in the minority households as well, for sure.
Definitely.
Where they come and they have a fear. So if you come from, because again it comes back to consolidating the roots and cultures of diaspora. If you come from Iraq in the 80s and the 90s, you come from a system of status is important to people. Why do people in those cultures have a lot of kids? Because historically, if you have lots of kids, then there's more income that comes into your family because they will work. And then that way, when you get old, you'll be looked after by your children and you can afford medicine. In that same culture, you care what people think about you. You care how you're perceived. Therefore, when you go abroad as children of those particular cultures, let's say my parents, they care about coming here and their children not being lost in the system or becoming like, the other culture or the othered culture. And these things, again, are part of understanding those differences and why they occur. What we have at home versus what we see outside are two different things. So our parents definitely have an influence on us, but they probably fear, or their fears originate from the original disseminations of knowledge that go as far back as Britain in colonial India, which creates like a superior versus inferior race that has many, many uncontrollable ramifications that continue to evolve. You know, like how you have variations of the COVID virus and more things. It's the exact same thing here.
It plays out in every aspect of society, and the idea of being, you said two really important things earlier on in the podcast, and you said two reasons why the powerful nation needs to make itself look better. Firstly, to convince its own people, and secondly, to convince the people that are under the subjugation said powers. Even as recently as a few months ago, when I was writing my dissertation on museums and decolonization, which I did a podcast for with Professor David Heathcote, even artifacts, even the idea of having people's history in our museums, there had to be an imbalance. There had to be an imbalance. There had to be a narrative that we as Westerners can take care of this better than you can. We as Westerners can understand this better than you can. And in some ways it was true, Bamo. And in some ways we were letting ourselves down. So for example, when you look at a lot of the remnants of Assyria, which come from Iraq, they were getting dug up by the British, the French, the Germans at a time when we as the ethnic people of Iraq didn't really seem to care about that history much. Or at least the public didn't. Bamo, I have a question to ask you. Growing up as a Kurd in Manchester, firstly, how many Kurds were you surrounded by when you were in college and high school? Do you know what I mean? Like, I was going to say other than yourself, but obviously other than yourself.
So when we lived in Fallowfield, I had a few Kurdish friends, maybe 3 or 4. Some of them lived on the same road that I lived in Fallowfield on Wilbraham Road. And some of which are big scholars now, actually, funnily enough, which I was speaking to the other day because we had a childhood photo. We used to play at Plattfields Park. So I had a few friends when I was at primary school, and I had a friend called Joseph as well when I first came to this country at 5 years old.
Was it Arabic or Kurdish?
Arab. But Kurdish, I had a few friends, again, they're not in school, by the way, none of them in school.
Yeah,
all just like, families,
that.
and none in school, none in either of my primary schools, none in high school, and none in university in my year. I was the only Kurdish person.
Did you grow up in a very English area?
Yes, I did.
So, you know when people talk about representation?
Yeah.
Everyone talks about the idea of seeing people like yourself around you. Did that ever affect you though? You are a very successful person. I'm not saying that because I know you or because you're in front of me, because you've achieved a lot. Not everyone can say they're an author, and not everyone can say they're a lecturer at a senior university, and not everyone can be both, right? So I mean that sincerely. Did that affect you though? Did you ever turn around and think, oh, why is the guy on TV not Kurdish? Or something like that?
My story is quite unique in the sense that I'm first generation migrant, first generation in the sense that whatever my parents went through, I felt that rupture as well. So I left my if I show you my childhood photos, you think this is the childhood of a prince, basically.
What age did you arrive in the UK?
5 years old.
Similar age to myself.
Yeah. But the love that I had from 2 rich families, being the first grandson, was unbelievable. I can't put that into words. And just, the camera era. My granddad having a camera, taking photos together. Just the lifestyle, being surrounded by family. You know how it is back home. You eat with, 15, 20 people. You don't eat just you, your mum and your dad. All those things were quite traumatic for me. Coming here to then all of a sudden we're in a flat, it's me, my mum, my dad, and I'm in this place. I just got thrown into school. year one, didn't speak a word of English, and slowly I started to understand. And my dad always tells me the story. He goes, "It broke my heart. She left you in there and you were looking at everybody else, what's going on." I think for me, then growing up where my parents were very, very political, because my granddad's side on my dad's side were very, very political. So always watching the news, all these kind of things. That affected me in a sense that when I went home and I watched, like, say, cartoons, or wanted to watch cartoons that the other kids were talking about, they had Sky or whatever.
Yeah.
I didn't have any of that. If I was watching a cartoon and my dad came home and or somebody had been, something had happened, then we had like a satellite, to get these channels from back home. The TV was dominating. And as a kid, you're fascinated by this box. You're 7, 8, 9, 10. And you start to watch it and take it in, what's happening. You see the emotions of your parents come out. I think that affected me more than actually going to school and feeling like, why am I, surrounded by X, Y, and Z. I had a few. I think there was a Pakistani and a Bangladeshi kid in my year. My friends were mainly English. And I grew up in terms of like socialization with a lot of English people in high school and primary school. One of them lived at the bottom of my road, Aiden, and we went to play for the same football team. So I think all that affected my outlook and worldview, that I didn't have that complex because I felt like I fitted in. Until, of course, a teacher would get my name wrong in terms of pronunciation. Or let's say...
What's the worst one you ever got?
Oh, I've had some... Can't remember the...
Let me guess. Bamo?
Bamo. I guess that. Probably... I think the worst thing for me at those times was that, you're not confident to kind of say your name how it should be said. And I remember having thoughts of like, what, or having, chicken nuggets at school or whatever, fish fingers, and then asking my mum not to be cooking our very healthy Mediterranean food. Say, why are we not having chicken dippers or whatever it is?
Yeah, I think
that everyone else is having. These are common things that you go through. But as far as my identity, I think I was kind of, I had assimilated quite well to the point where I probably felt no different to anybody else, except those instances where I thought, why do I have my foreign name? And also, I think speaking to my parents about these things, they didn't really understand it. They were so fixated on making sure that we have a shelter, we live in a good place, that we have a decent school, and the rest, as far as their knowledge knew of these societies, is that everything takes care of itself. So I think I wasn't as affected. And even at university, I had a lot of mixed friends. I didn't just hang around with one particular group that I resonated with. I think that helped me, but I know that my friends who had grown up in more or less privileged socio-economic areas had that mentality that they didn't have any, let's say, native English friends as much as they did their own, people and cultures. And part of it is natural. You flock to people commonalities with, but it can limit our worldviews and our career trajectories down the line, because your friends are like your echo chambers and they're your enablers.
Firstly, I want to say me and you have had very similar experiences, both coming here at the same age, both having those issues of having to socialize into a society that we're not used to, both being used to very busy environments and then coming here and being alone. And I say alone as well, because your two other siblings were born in the UK. So you had a period in Kurdistan and here in the UK where you were the only child.
Yeah.
Which you then had two other siblings. I didn't. I've been the only child all my life. But I'm trying to draw parallels. And you're right, by the way. Kurdish people are very headstrong. We very much have that national identity of we're Kurds and we are from Kurdistan. And that political thing does kind of hang over our heads. I'll never forget this. I actually give it as an example. And I've not seen this kid since Kurdish school. But do you remember that Kurdish school that used to be in Levenshulme?
I do remember.
And that's how political Kurds can get. There was this 4-year-old kid. He went up to get a sticker. The teacher asked him what colour, and he said green. And you know why he said green? Because it represented the political party. Because there's two major political parties back in Kurdistan, even to this day. And that's just an example of how much politics can dominate the ideology of any Kurdish person, even a 4-year-old boy who went up to get a sticker and chose green. probably to go home and make his parents proud. Whether that's good or bad is not the discussion that we're on. We just go to the immigration statistics, by the way. Primarily, I'm going to start with some English ones and then we'll go to the rest of the world. It has been reported that 1.1 million people have arrived in the UK recently within the last few years. Claim that their net migration is just over 500,000, so that means people coming and going. However, it was kind of stagnant during COVID because the whole world stopped. And then what we had was conflict after conflict, including the Ukraine war. And further on, I want to ask you a question. I'm not sure if you'll get this. I wouldn't have got this either. How many millions of people do you think were a result of diaspora in the year 2000?
Is it in the millions?
Oh, of course. We're talking over 100 million.
Wow. As a diaspora, just due to being refugees, but for any reason?
Collectively.
Probably in the 80 millions?
No, 173.
Wow.
173. And in 2010, it was 221 million. And in 2022, we have reached 281 million people. 2/3 of these migrants actually only go to about 20 countries. The guesses, you're not going to get any awards for the guesses. What is it? It's America, it's England, it's Germany. The USA has attracted 51 million people, and that is 18% of all migrants. Germany 16 million, Saudi Arabia 13 million, the Russian Federation 12, and the United Kingdom, where we are 5th, with 9 million. I found this list very interesting because for some reason, and maybe because I live in a bubble of the Western world, I didn't think Saudi Arabia would be so high up. But then you look at the migration of Yemenis to Saudi Arabia or North Africans to Saudi Arabia. The underlying narrative is that people are always going to countries they perceive they will have more opportunity in, not necessarily freedom. And when you're poor, money is your first priority, so you don't necessarily think of freedom and a glamorous lifestyle, because with all due respect, when people migrate to Saudi Arabia, they can't do whatever the hell they want, but they can make money. From your professional opinion, where do you think these migrant numbers are heading? Considering that it's 281 million now, what would be your projection for 2030?
Well, the official...
Well, you don't actually have to give a projection.
The official... So at One Young World, refugees, I think the UN has given global refugees now their own flag, and there are around 100 million global refugees. Their prediction... A number that rings a bell is 300 million refugees by, I think it's like 2030. I read recently that Zurich, the insurance company, is predicting 1.2 billion migrants related to climate migration as well around the world. So just that amount of people moving, so 1/8, if you like, almost, or over 1/8 of the world's population being in motion, means that infrastructure is going to be affected.
I just found one of my other stats. In 2020, as I mentioned, there were 221 million migrants collectively, so whether they're students or refugees. 12% of them were actually refugees. And what you're alluding to is that number will increase.
Yeah, drastically. And by the way, these numbers...
And that's very believable.
You have to always give or take a 40 to 50%. So where measurements do take place is where registrations of migration have taken place formally or informally, or let's say formally and officially through passports and border controls. They're the most official way. But then you have migrants who register as refugees, and you also have a massive proportion that you cannot estimate of undocumented people, right? And the undocumented element could honestly, 40 to 50% of that number could easily increase by that much, if not by 100%. And that's the reality of it.
As a Kurd, I've actually met people like that who, I mean, I might have not known it at the time that I met them, but then someone else would have told me they have no legal papers.
Yeah.
They are undocumented. They work and get paid under the counter. And there's also people who, before surrendering themselves over, which is literally the exact term they use, literally surrendering yourself. A lot of people also stay under the radar and try to build up a good case. And I just want to highlight something. If anyone is listening to this and thinking to themselves, why are they working undocumented? Why are they working under the table? You gotta really understand that these people do risk a lot and in many cases come from nothing. So you can't hold them to the same level that you would hold a British national or even people like me and you. Because I know some people scoff at that. What? Not paying taxes? Working under the table? I understand their perspective if anyone is thinking like that, listening to this, but these people come from desperation.
Yeah.
And they see some horrible, treacherous things on their way here. And they probably even see other people die if it's not people that they personally know. And as we've seen in the last couple of years, the Conservative government has been trying to cut down on the mass amount of people arriving on these boats.
Yeah.
Very unsafe methods. But that is the level of desperation that these people have to try and make a change, because often they come from countries where there might be too much political turmoil, there might be no opportunity. My father always makes the example. He says after he graduated, there were literally no jobs for him to even do. These tensions in these foreign countries, they're not always just about underprivileged people running away for a job. Sometimes it's even the educated. So for Iraq, you'd have the Iraq and Iran war, you'd have the Kuwait issue, you have the war of 2003, which we touched on greatly in the last time you were here. So I just wanted people to understand that, those listening, these people do come from desperation. And I think they do deserve our empathy and sympathy, which the government has not been very nice with recently. However, that's their initiative and they can talk about that in their own time. That's not what we're here for. But I want to go back on to the point that you made about the climate crisis. Can you explain for the people listening why the climate might actually affect someone's lifestyle? Because people usually see it from the outside perspective of, oh, the world just gets a bit warmer. No, but how does that affect their livelihood?
Yeah, I mean, simple things. So if you kind of put it into perspective, just not starting from where we are, London was 40 degrees in the summer, right?
That's Slimani levels.
Yeah, 40 degrees, right? So London became like Barcelona. And you have to then put into context the architecture. You're an architect.
The architecture of this country is not built for such temperatures.
Exactly. Well, our houses are made to keep the heat in, right? So you can't look at society as all able people, able-bodied, ready to move out and to take, adequate decisions under those circumstances. And also consider people's working conditions. London becomes 40 degrees. Barcelona is predicted to become as hot as Riyadh, right?
So 50.
Yeah, 50, 60 degrees. Yeah,
wow.
Right? So...
Just for perspective, I'm sorry, Bamo. Riyadh in Saudi Arabia is a country that has a desert. So that's how geographically warm it is.
Yeah.
As far as I know, there are no deserts in Spain.
Yeah.
So that is...
So
wow.
Put it into perspective. What happens when things get... What do you do in the summer? When it's really hot, what do people do to sleep at night?
Oh, they AC, open windows. If you're from Kurdistan or the Middle East, you have a balcony and you have a bed up there.
Yeah.
So things that we can't do in the UK.
Yep. So that puts pressure on our electricity grids. Okay, and the wealthy don't take out the wealthy who will probably put in high-end air conditioning units. Maybe not in the UK with the cost of living crisis at the moment. You're going to see a lot of pressure on electricity grids. And I'll contextualize that using Iraq, right? In the summer, you cannot sleep. If you're in an apartment or you're in a house, you cannot sleep indoors. Even with their houses that are built to keep the heat out, for example, and to be cool, you cannot sleep, right? What did we see this summer? Newborn babies. I mean, I haven't had kids. I really, really kind of empathize with this, and it hit me really emotionally that newborn babies and toddlers couldn't sleep, so their parents were getting in their cars, driving them around all night, just so they could sleep in air conditioning. Now imagine
In the cars, the air
in
conditioning
the
in the
cars, they're driving around. Imagine the air pollution and the quality of air in the evening, which always, when daylight and evening is always different air quality. The dirtiness and the levels of pollution and toxicity in the air, in unproper cleaned fuel anyway in Iraq. So the emissions aren't really, EC or EU or UK tested, right? There was almost a whole group of people being poisoned by there. When I say group, I mean in the thousands, right? That's one element. The other element is resources, people not being able to operate businesses because of, let's say, in the agriculture sector, a place like the Middle East might be rich. It was once, the richest, most fertile part in the world, this Mesopotamia, now becoming infertile, right? Because of, the dryness of the marshes. Of course, Iran and Turkey have played a part. Then you have to contextualize 700,000 Iraqis enter the job market every year with no prospects already. Where are they going to go?
Sorry, did these include people with or without a degree?
Yeah, this is qualified people leaving higher education.
700,000 just them, so we're not even considering the people who
already exist on that. Yeah, 700,000 each year. So you can imagine it's almost like a Ponzi scheme of continues to multiply. They've got no way of making income. Their countries have become infertile. Normally, when you're an infertile country, what happens when you don't have your own water? You become a importing country. You don't produce anything. And when you import, then you have more inequality. More inequality means more poverty. So those people, they're going to have to leave. They're also part of the culture again. They're growing at a fast pace. One of the fastest growing populations in the world, Iraq. Right? The rate of people, having babies, 70% of the country is under 35 years of age.
That is actually lit.
Yeah,
for us in the future, if we manage that properly, Iraq could genuinely be a powerhouse.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I'm saying to you, that look at that example. So where are they going to go? Those countries that you mentioned. And these numbers are increasing. Now that's just Iraq. Don't think about, we're not even talking about other areas, let's say parts of China, Indonesia. I think is at risk from climate change. So many different parts of the world.
Even, we'll come on to this later, but even the Western world, places where you'd think they don't have these problems, they have these problems. And can I give a small analogy of your point? When it gets too hot and the land becomes infertile, the crops fail. When the crops fail, in extreme cases, you have long droughts, but then you have rainfall consistently and too much for a short period of time, which leads to a flood. So now you have two ways in which your crops can fail. The country being too hot, and then the area being flooded. That creates food shortage. Food shortage creates it disturbs the market. Therefore, food becomes more expensive. Therefore, we have, like you said, a crisis. People are unable to eat properly or get their family the necessary needs.
I mean, take all of that out of the equation. Let's assume that Iraq is the most resilient country on earth, which probably is. Water drought is that you can't produce water for your 40 plus million population. And if there is little water, and let's say that's one issue.
Well, yeah, there is a water problem in Iraq.
Yeah, there's a water problem. Let's just even take that out of the equation. Rising temperatures increases the pressure on electricity grids. The amount of people who die because of being dehydrated, being polluted by the air, diseases that come from the polluted air, diseases that come from poor sanity, it creates like a cycle of pressure on electricity grids. What happens if there is a society where there doesn't have adequate electricity in the technology era? investors and foreign corporations and foreign direct investment then goes away? What happens if there's little or no investment, little or no jobs? People literally won't be able to survive. And it's that level of reality that migrant that you're talking about leaves for a better life. And then they're described as swarms, and then their names are mispronounced, and then everything else that
they look down
there.
upon.
But that's still compared to what they're facing at home. Even if you have a university degree, it's not just going for a better way of life, it's also the psychological impact of that. So I might go and take a job as a politician or as a lecturer, and I've had so many great offers over the years where I make loads of money and I can live in a very nice penthouse, and I probably won't ever see these people that are struggling. But if I'm a human being and I socialise with ordinary people, or I drive the roads to go and fill my car up with petrol, I'm by default going to see and hear these stories. The average human is very, very sensitive to what's going on around them, right? And when people move to, let's say, you hear it in a young British male or female, I'm going to go backpacking in Australia. They don't go to Australia because it's rich in minerals. They go because of the vibe and the positivity of people travelling and having good vibes. And that element is also a requirement, that you have a healthy society, social structure for people's mental health. That alone can be, and then if you want to talk about the mental health as well, as a result of all of what we've discussed, mental health, one in 4 people in Iraq, having suicidal thoughts. Suicide rates are very, very high.
And it's not also
males and females.
It's also not a country that educates much about mental health, is it?
No, because the culture is so behind. The political system is so fixed on reacting to everyday problems.
Or being dominant and keeping everyone else
or
oppressed.
being dominant. Yeah. That it plays a firefighting role. There's no proactive measures in place. So coming back to the kind of core argument, if you like, of the climate migration problem, we're going to see this. Iraq is a bad example. It's a small example. There are many more countries. There's over 192, I think, sovereign states. It's going to affect everybody, and it's going to put pressure on production lines. Okay, so the cost of living crisis, don't think that's the beginning and the end. No matter how much you try and control inflation, we're going to see more production lines disrupted because of this climate crisis, higher costs of living, and we're going to see more migration to certain areas, which is basically going to put so much pressure on grids and infrastructures that we're going to have to even rethink the way we've built our houses and our places.
Even here in the UK. And
especially here.
Actually, we saw that a few months ago, didn't we? With, I think in a single day, more fire engines were called out. People died. Our roads, our networks were damaged. So it's a lot to think about. Bamo, a few months ago during the summer, Pakistan was hit by some startling figures due to mass floods. Do you kind of remember what went on and stuff like that? So I have some stats here, and I can't begin to actually explain how bad it was. So the recent floods in Pakistan, by the way, as a neighbouring country as well, Bangladesh, it's worth noting that places in Bangladesh and India also suffer from these. But what we saw in the summer in relation to Pakistan was tragic beyond all expectation. 4 of the country's provinces were affected by that flood. 15% of the population. I don't know the population of Pakistan, but even if it's 50 million, then what would that be? 15 million people, as an estimate, right? I'll get the exact stats in a minute for how many people live in Pakistan. But an estimated 5 million people are still exposed to this day because they haven't been properly displaced and there hasn't been enough money and resources to fix the problem which is coming through from nature, but it is climate change. 89,000 people still remain displaced from their home, while Pakistan being responsible for less than 1% of the world's CO2 emissions.
Wow.
Which is 33 million people were affected. At the time, these stats are from January. It's said that over 17,000 people died. And livestock, by the way, in places like Pakistan or those areas which aren't very rich, livestock is very important because a lot of these people are farmers. 1.2 million animals in livestock also died. So that's their whole livelihood. You know, sometimes we look at these tragedies and we think 17,000 people died. But how many more people are going to die and going to be affected by lack of financial incentives moving forward because the farmer can no longer produce for the next spring or summer? How many of their chickens died? How many of their cows? You know, how does that affect them? How does that affect their family? I'm not going to ask how we can prevent such floods because such natural disasters, no modern day piece of engineering can really prevent it. I mean, there are debates about it. So, for example, not to go off on a tangent, but as an architecture student, this year my site is in Schiedam, which is in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And as you know, or for those that don't know, Netherlands is practically below sea level because that's just how it is. One thing they do have is this massive structure, which is about 200 meters wide and about 20 meters high, I think, which automatically shuts when it senses that the water levels are rising too much. So that becomes a barrier for Rotterdam and the Netherlands in general. However, I say that to say this. The Netherlands can afford it. Countries like Pakistan that can't. What are their alternatives?
Well, the fact of the matter is that there are no alternatives apart from, of course, reparations and putting this cost, if you like, on the highest polluters, which, you know, your Russia's, USA's, China's, I think in the top 3 or top 5. So
I can already see a problem with that. Will those countries actually take responsibility, or will they keep kicking that can down the road and say, well, it's natural and we can't prevent it?
No. At COP, the talk of reparations, I think that, if I'm not mistaken, at the COP27, for the first time ever, for this specific issue, although we'll talk of it. But what I will say is that with this, it's about thinking long term. This is not, there's a problem, there's a hole in the wall, we need to patch it up. This is about long term.
Yeah, because this could happen again.
Yeah. Well, it's for sure it's going to happen again. I wrote an article in The Conversation, I think it was in March time. Iraq became the first country to actually protest against the rising food prices. That was March last year. What we're actually going to see, okay, and this is going to be a very, very powerful moment in history, is rising food prices will cause food insecurity. Food insecurity is the reason that we've had so many revolutions in history. When you have food insecurity, governments will basically collapse. People will hit the street. Water insecurity is already like a big thing in many countries, especially in the Middle East region. So we're going to see rises in this. But in terms of solutions, the only solution is what the UN have come up with, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, where they're treating all of those, I think 16 of them are actual things to kind of aim for, and the 17 is for partnerships to achieve these goals. But the UN, as an institution, for the first time have come up with a solution that's not just based on governments and corporations doing things, but actually individuals in their own communities and places incrementally playing their part to achieve things like zero hunger, zero poverty, sustainable cities, towns, etc. And I think this is something that we're going to have to take examples, unfortunately, like Pakistan, to come up with long-term solutions as opposed to trying to kind of accept it as it is or try to live with it, which is now what fossil fuel companies are trying to push, that we kind of accept it and, you know, survival of the fittest.
Yeah, they look at, for example, they look at trends and they say that these things happen every few years and stuff like that. All I'm hearing, though, from the UN is word. What are the actual physical things that are going to be done to prevent something like this happening? So that example that I gave you about the piece of construction outside of Rotterdam, which prevents flood, will there be funding for that? Will there be funding for anything like that? Because architecturally and engineering-wise, that is one way in which you can prevent a flood. But then floods can come from many different ways. it can come from an upstream river, come from heavy rainfall, so it can come from inside your country or a neighboring country, which rivers pass through. It doesn't just have to be from the ocean. And right now, from the UN and from a lot of these major companies, I just hear words all the time, and maybe I'm looking at it a bit too easily and saying, well, why can't they just do this? Why can't they just do that? But to give you all an example of the level of damages, 14.9 billion in damages, 15.2 billion in economic loss, 16.3 billion has been estimated for reconstruction and rehabilitation. 15% of rice crops were ruined during this, and 40% of cotton. Leads to food shortages, which again leads to, what did you call it? Hunger? Not hunger strikes, food shortages.
Yeah, insecurity. Yeah.
Food insecurity. And over 26,000 schools were damaged, by the way.
Well, coming back to the UN, not to be a poster boy for the UN.
No, it's fine. We're here to push narratives.
Yeah, of course. I think you have to look at it in this, and this is the way I teach about this particular topic. In 1945, post the immediate aftermath of World War II, and let's say that era, late 40s, the UN is established, the United Nations, the UN Charter, and then you have this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first ever document to actually talk about human rights as being fundamental and applying to all, regardless of colour, creed, race, gender, sex, whatever. At that moment, corporations, and again a world heavily involved in a Cold War and also involved in this dominant, kind of neoliberal capitalist model, is probably hype, basically. As you said there, the UN is doing nothing. These narratives were quite dominant.
It appears that way.
It appears that way. But because let me put it into context, right?
I just want to say one thing. What happened in Pakistan was ridiculously drastic. However, such things have happened in other areas of the world. Yeah. So it's not like what we saw just happened in 2022, a few months ago. Yeah. Things have happened, maybe not in Pakistan, but in other countries. So the reason I use the Dutch as an example is because they were a nation under threat from floods all the time, and they've known this for decades. And they put initiative into place to put mechanisms there, including natural dikes, which they use pretty much everywhere you go. There's always slopes in the Netherlands because of the dikes, right? We recently went to Schiedam and Rotterdam. What I'm trying to say is, Bamo, these are not new. When there is a vision to fix the problem, like the Netherlands had, they fixed or tried to prevent the problem. The United Nations, it seems like for the longest time, has just been talking. Okay,
so coming back to the original point I was making, you make a very good point, by the way, but I'm going to put into context. When the UN came out with its declaration, which is now the most translated document in the world, this is basically a conceptualization of knowledge of the way the world should be and should operate, right? Simple things like good working conditions, good physical health care, mental health care, all these things. Even mental health and well-being was mentioned at that juncture, but it took about 40 years to actually disseminate into our political systems. So then states were like, this is unrealistic, similar to what we're seeing with the SDGs now, will never be achieved, probably never happen. And then 1970s, you had the the covenants on socio-political rights, economic rights, etc. And this was like a guidance for states to say, right, these particular areas, they're a must and you have to focus on implementing them. By 2013 and 14, we saw the first seed of 1948 actually become a fruit.
What was that?
And I'm going to tell you, through the kind of the implementation of the mental health elements of the working environment. I remember after I left law school, working in the insurance sector, where your boss would come to your table, and I've had this numerous times, and throw a big heap of papers, like you see in the films, onto your desk and say, I need this by Monday. And it would be Friday, 4 p.m. And you're just thinking, my weekend has just been cancelled, right? That was before data protection and don't take, client details home with you or whatever. And you'd have to do it. And there were even people that would be given that same thing to do over a day or two. They'd pull an all-nighter to manage their workload. They'd be having all sorts of mental health issues. But if you complain to your boss, you know what your boss would say to you? If you can't do the job, you know where the door is.
Mate, that sounds like architecture school.
Yeah.
Except you can't get a sack.
Architecture school. This is the mentality. Then I remember specifically this implementation of mental health and well-being quite late after this kind of mental health act had morphed into various different things, and the corporate sector now had government guidance. Now you could turn around to your boss and say, actually, that's a bit too much for me. I know myself, I can't handle that. I need help, I need support. I'll take 2 of these pages and I'll do my best to get it back to you by Monday, but if I don't shoot me. My mental health and well-being is important.
That's become a big thing now, which
it's a big thing, but if we didn't have the UDHR in 48 bringing that in, and then the covenants, we wouldn't be where we are now. It would still be the same thing, right? Even little things. So it was quite normal for you to be in a job, right? To be in a job and you don't have any employment rights and you do something wrong, or the boss has had a bad day, he's woke up on the wrong side of the bed, or something's not been right for him. Because you know what? You're annoying me, you're pissing me off, get out the door, I've had enough of you. Those things are normal. Then you had workers' rights, right? Workers' rights, trade unions. You could turn around and say, look, actually, I'm going to give you 3 strikes. It's in your contract. I'm going to give you a warning. And you can't just sack somebody. You have to give them every chance to... All these things are revolutionary, but they've contributed to a better work-life balance, better mental health balance, right? What I'm trying to say to you is back then, with limited resources, ideas took ages to disseminate. It took over 50, 60 years for all that to actually become enacted into ways where we feel tangibly that something has happened. And the UDHR and the UN's role, we're now a beneficiary of that. An architecture school seems to be behind.
Very behind.
With that, because that means that they're acting unsustainably.
Wow.
Which brings me on to the sustainability in the corporate sector.
I have 2 questions before you do that. Actually, I'll ask one and I'll save one for another time. I assume when you were given this huge pile of paperwork to do, you also didn't get paid overtime for it. That's also very common. Your boss telling you they want something, but they're not paying you for it.
You know what they used to say? They say, you get paid. And it was a well-paying job at the time, in fairness. You get paid enough, don't complain. You should be grateful you got a job. That's what they meant. And this was in one of the...
Which I don't want to... Something I would believe more now, because we have such a crisis. If you turn around and said you'd be grateful to have a well-paying job, you might be like, 2023, England, yeah, maybe I should be grateful. But back then, everyone was working. It was a better society. I think it was under the Labour government as well. It was fruitful in England. So grateful for what? You're treating me like shit.
Well, I'm not going to name the company because it is a major corporation.
Do you want me to say it? Write it down.
No. I'm not going to say it. Just to get your former colleagues or whatever. But this was the way, right? And then we all became a beneficiary of that. You know, things like your productivity time, and now, of course, with COVID, it's changed a lot. So you have that refresh on a bigger scale because dissemination and spreading ideas is 1,000,000 times more effective and easier. One example, if you want to look at with the Sustainable Development Goals, is that they're being strict. They're not saying we need to reduce hunger. They're saying zero hunger. Okay? Good. We're saying zero poverty now. But this is now such a movement because of trends from Gen Z, and I'm going to talk about Gen Z and George Floyd in a sec. It's such a movement that corporations, major corporations, by the way, were at One Young World, and I had the opportunity to put some pressure and heat on some of the big players and representatives from there to have those powerful conversations. They're making all these changes now, not just to whitewash, but to actually change their practices. And if you look at the definition of sustainability, living and operating today whilst not sacrificing, tomorrow's resources or the future of the world, basically. It's interesting to see that transition. I'm going to give you that stat now. So Forbes, you've heard of Forbes, the big company. In 2018, they put out a very, very controversial stat saying that new generation, and Generation Z in particular, they see, because there's this kind of less they have less discretionary income, let's say Gen Z, they were quite young at the time, they have less discretionary income. So what they do is they see their purchases as investments in causes, and they will boycott a particular firm if they are deemed to be unethical in any way, shape or form. So it brought out a lot of controversy that, wow, this Gen Z, their purchasing power is now in contention because they will make purchases based on ethics. Massive news for the whole UN Sustainable Development Goals, because at the end of the day, I remember when I was at university and I was graduated, it was just all it was get a good job, no problem, get a great job and go and live your life, okay? Buy a house, whatever you want to do. Now, young people, they're going to university worried about how difficult their living and working conditions will be because of this climate crisis, right? This is kind of one thing that I want to allude to. So they really care. Since Forbes, loads of other companies have come out and said, look, this isn't a small issue. This is a major issue. We need to kind of change. At One Young World, there was a former child slave, okay, that had been in slavery for so many years of her life, undocumented birth. I think she's from India. She had been kept working. I think there's 40 million child slaves in the world right now. And we had a workshop with her, and she basically just asked us all, said, do you know, who knows where their clothes come from, where they were made? And when she asked that question, everybody in the room was kind of shocked, thinking, well, I know it's made from Top Man or whatever. And she said, do you know when you go and buy a top in Primark or, wherever for 7-8 quid, it is impossible to make a product of that clothing, that quality, for that price, that someone somewhere, or many people, have basically been not paid or not paid incorrectly or subjugated to things like child slavery. And again, 40 million child slaves in the world. She, from the age of, I think, 7 or 8, was working 10, 15 hours a day. And you could tell that she'd been through a hard time.
How old was she at the time when she's speaking to you?
She was, I think they did some research into her age. She was in her 30s.
When was she saved from the slavery?
I don't know the details of her story, but I know that One Young World picked her up, and her story has inspired the major corporations.
Can I ask you something? Was she a lucky person who was picked up, or did they save a bunch of people? Do you know that context?
I don't know the context, but I know that she, in a dramatic way, managed to be saved. But I think she was one of few, and is still, as I said, 40 million child slaves. And the way this industry is so underexplored is because it fits the narratives of major corporations in terms of the clothing industry not to highlight this. And I'm coming on to the shifts that we're seeing now. So IKEA, everyone knows IKEA, picks up on this. And the CEO and directors of IKEA were there. They kind of started to look into their own practices. What does everyone buy when they go to IKEA? Oh, everyone likes to buy these cushions. They hug them when they're watching a film or whatever. And one of the things that came out of that talk was that we need to cut the gap between the consumer and the producer. Because if you know how whatever you're buying is produced, again, jumping onto the Gen Z momentum and the SDGs, then you're going to purchase more sustainably and more consciously.
Ethically.
Yeah, more ethically as well. With those cushions, I think they found out that they make them in Jordan, and the first kind of step was to find a way to create that connection between the consumer and the producer. So the people making those cushions, not only would they be now given better working conditions, all the relevant things in terms of ethics, but they would be given the extra time to stitch their initials on that cushion. So when you're sat in England or New York or America or wherever, and you're hugging that cushion in a scary film, you're connecting with that person, right? That's minor, but then you look at other areas.
At least you know that it was built, made ethically.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a major step in itself, considering that a lot of our clothes, £8 pieces or fast fashion, 30p t-shirts or whatever, these are all
countries like Pretty Little Thing. Not countries, companies, sorry.
Companies, yeah. And then Audi picked up on this. So I think a lot of the kids that get kidnapped battery pickers, like what you see in Slumdog Millionaire. So they basically went and created a recycling plan for batteries. So they provided their own machinery in India to recycle batteries, and also to take batteries from Europe to recycle them in India, using one of the startups in India itself, so empowering the local people, and then creating solar power chargers to recycle those batteries into power banks that could be used in the night time to give electricity to stalls, and also to people who need it at home to study with, etc., building capacity. And they took it further and bought and made electrical rickshaw, those little peewee taxis that you see in India.
Yes.
Electrical of those, but made completely from recyclable materials.
Brilliant.
So we're seeing a complete shift in the sense that for the first time ever, corporations aren't just doing it to whitewash. They're under pressure because their potential customers be lost, or they're going to be buying in to their ideas and visions. So I'm more confident now in terms of, I'm looking at things as a long term, because I'm not an engineer. I'm not somebody to say how things will work out or how we'll solve or prevent a Pakistan flood happening. I'm looking at a kind of grander scale, a knowledge dissemination, that things took time, but they will get to the individual, as we saw with the mental health, which is a massive thing. The amount of students who would get chucked out up till, let's say, 2012, 13, 14 for missing a deadline, to the amount of students who are now consolidated in their mental health needs from higher education. Unbelievable. That's life-changing. That student who leaves university because their institution didn't support their mental health, and a lot of them tend to be diaspora again, believe it or not, battling two different cultures or managing two different cultures. This is life-changing because those people then go into the working world. They have a much better life and future. So it will reach, but this time with the SDGs, I think the pressure's higher. Corporations are now looking at things in a completely different way, and we're seeing changes that we've never seen before. Not only that, organizations like the UN, One Young World, they're placing more emphasis, and even the corporate sector now is giving grants to startups to bring new sustainable methods, ways, solutions into each part of the world. It's disastrous in one way, but then it's beautiful in a sense that all of us are bound by this. We're brought together by this challenge that we face of the climate, and it needs all of our solutions and visions. And when you go somewhere like the COP27, or you go to One Young World, you actually see that, there is a hell of a lot being done, but we just don't see it. Because if we did see that this is the movement, then that also disturbs political systems, the power of the corporate world, the fossil fuel industry, who are spending more money than ever in carrying on and expanding their practices, and also putting down what loads of, all the changes that are taking place, and to put down also the play down the climate crisis. So we're seeing definitely a lot more questioning, a lot more consciousness, more so than we ever have before. So for that reason, I'm very, very optimistic. I'm always optimistic anyway, but I'm not going to at the same time be able to say, this is what the solution is to Pakistan, because we're going to see loads of symptoms and they're not going to go away that easily. But we're also in a good place in terms of the long term, where we're starting to think more, but we're nowhere near where we should be. I'm just saying that there is a shift.
You're so astute in these things, probably because you're a lecturer and you're very much used to interviews and stuff like that, is that you can efficiently go on for a good 30 minutes solid. Mashallah, I genuinely admire it. Because I tend to think of myself as someone who's very good at communicating, and then I'm just humbled in your presence. I'm like, this guy, there's level of shit. I'm not there yet.
You know what? It's taken years.
It's practice. It's practice. And also, of course.
Another funny thing is, I used to prepare for these things a lot. I even prepared a lot for Americanism.
I could tell.
I was really ill when I did a Parliament talk recently, just before Christmas. I was worn out.
Oh, you were
out.
in Parliament?
Yeah, House of Commons.
That's really interesting. I want you to tell everyone about this. So, Bamo, like, we know you're an author. We know you're a lecturer at university. Is it still London? University
of West London.
But you also gave a talk at Parliament.
It was at the House of Commons.
When was this?
This was in December. I think it was the 14th of December.
Is this before or after Rishi?
No, it's way after. Rishi. Well, as in after Rishi was in authority. It was actually on the relationship between Erbil and Baghdad.
Right.
And where that may be heading as a trajectory.
Did you meet the Iraqi MP at the time? The previous...
No, the minister who's currently all over the news.
Yes, but
No, I didn't.
Yeah, I was just curious because him being Kurdish, born in Iraq. I mean, Baghdad.
I think so. Yeah.
Even he doesn't have the greatest reputation, but as Kurds and Iraqis, we still are kind of proud that there's someone there.
Absolutely.
Representing. Going back to our initial point, we talked about Pakistan, but even in the Western world, even in the more developed world, we see problems like this. America is a very good example of this. America itself is a continent. It's like you say England is a country, right? You say United Kingdom, talking about 2 islands. America is massive. Even in America, we've seen over the years they have many hurricanes. Here's a list of countries which are affected potentially by climate change. Boston, New York, New Jersey, North Carolina, Louisiana, Florida, California, Arizona. Small example. Southern Arizona gets too hot. Everyone moves to Northern Arizona. What then happens is you kind of have this rent crisis because people who can afford to move are moving, and then rent gets more expensive, life gets harder for the current people in Northern Arizona, so on and so forth. But something else that I found out as I was prepping for this podcast is there's the problem with the people who can't move. We've talked about how these new changes within our environment can cause migration. Some people can't. For example, old people. In some cases, it's hard for them to even move home. They might be alone. What ends up happening is, let's take Arizona for an example, or just any American state. A lot of people move out because they want, how do I put this? Would you consider an easier life to live in a better climate?
It's linked to their survival, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, of course. So they move, and then all of a sudden, because of the way the capitalist society works, the taxes decrease. So the people that can't move or are unable to, they are then not as well looked after, actually. So it's a double-edged sword. On one end, you have to remain where you can't financially move out of, but then they will not have the means to take care of you in 10, 20 years' time when so many major taxpayers leave because they can get jobs, they can work from home, they can afford to move around. So the climate crisis, we've talked about it hitting the food market, but even the rent market, even moving to places which are less prone to a natural disaster or to a rising degree of heat. And then I stumbled across something else as well. You talked about climate refugees. Honduras is an example. Recently, or throughout the past, a lot of people have left Honduras to go to America to try and, escape these natural disasters, only to find that another country they're in also has natural disasters. It's amazing how quickly these things have happened, because mass carbon emissions in this world haven't been going on for that long. Now, the fossil fuels that we dig out of the ground might be millions and billions of years old, right? But the actual way we've started producing these CO2 emissions really only kicked off with major industrialization in the mid-20th century. But how quickly have we moved from, oh, it's easier for me to get a car now. Oh, it's easier for me to get these clothes. Okay, this is now harming our planet drastically. It's baffling. I don't know how anyone could have even... I don't know if they could have predicted that. Maybe they could have. Maybe they knew it was happening with industrialization. But the turnaround is less than 100 years, Bamo. You know, if we look at the first trade and stuff like that, well, that's different. Let's just look at major consumption.
Well, one of the things that you said that's very, very prominent for me, again, from a political perspective, political analyst, instability is the pet peeve and the biggest fear of governments and corporations, right?
That's why they try to downplay tragedies. No government wants to be full front control of a country when something big is coming out.
Yeah.
And they love the idea of blaming somebody else, but they will take the praise if they do it right.
Yeah, of course. And you've always had that in history. And
Yeah.
of course, race, as we talked about earlier, that's always been a good scapegoat during Brexit, during divided America in the Civil War. This was a big part. You know, race was prominent. When there's a problem, race always comes into it. And sometimes also tragedies can be utilized by governments for their own narratives, you know, to for or against, for whatever benefit there is. But what I want to kind of bring in more optimism into it is that the instability that is projected, 1.2 billion refugees and migrants due to the climate, Zurich Insurance have predicted by 2050, that instability will affect the whole system of control and power, which is what governments are interested in and corporations depend upon. And again, for corporations, that means their labour forces. That means the markets that they invest in. They're going to have to rethink. Political parties and politicians and governments, they need to maintain stability and sovereignty. Yet if you've got mass amounts of people coming into your country, more than your own population, before you know it, you could be facing war inside your own country just to maintain your sovereignty. So we're going to see a lot of things that we saw as absolute givens, if you like, in the former century be turned quickly into grey areas and quickly also reviewed, because this is the speed of which these changes are taken. And that's why the climate change thing is taken so seriously by corporations, because they have to take it seriously, otherwise their own future. Because for corporations, it's not just, you know, the products they make, it's their workers, it's the resources. You've got a plastic problem, plastic shortage in the world.
But also using plastic is harmful for our environment.
Yeah.
Our oceans are getting very dirty.
Well, that's one of the Sustainable Development Goals, that we're taking more out of our oceans than ever before. We're putting more back in, and that's
but nothing useful
changing.
back in.
Yeah.
Our coral reefs are being destroyed. Yes, it's sad, and this has all happened very quickly. There's probably a lot of people out there alive, let's say in England or in America, or even any Western country, that first saw the big headline of major factories and everyone working, like General Motors. Look how big they were once upon a time. Then they shut down. Then they went abroad. And now it's all one big catastrophe. I am optimistic like you. Apparently, I'm like 3 years out of Gen Z, so I'm like an end of time millennial. But yeah, no, I am seeing a lot of
and
good examples.
I'll give you one context that is probably worth kind of sharing and is very, very powerful. Forbes in 2018 predicted this whole Gen Z movement, right? That this is what's happening. Corporations, beware with caution, that this generation will see their investments as their purchases as investments in causes, almost like charity. They can't afford to give charity, but where they buy, they're looking more than ever before. Before, nobody cared. I grew up, obviously, spending 3 years of my life in law school, wanting to become a lawyer, and I was going to work either as a criminal lawyer or in contracts in the sports industry. A lot of my friends are football agents, for example. And if they're not agents, they work on the contract side of the sport industry, should I say, which is a more correct term. I remember looking at football player contracts, and this was back in like 2012, 13, even 2011 when I was a student, 2010, thinking, wow, footballers can't say anything or do anything remotely appearing to be political on a particular side. And then I used to look at The Sun, which I used to buy before I went to university. I used to read because of the football gossip and all these things. And you never hear that you could never conceptualize Sky Sports saying something like Black Lives Matter. And also being from Manchester, a funny yet powerful story about the irony of how powerful this city is. Well, not a funny story, a powerful story. In 1860, when those cotton workers who had limited lifespans because they were working in very bad conditions, I think they lived to
in the
40,
mills.
in the mills, when they found out that their cotton is from slavery, they turned around and said, we're not. They went on strike and protest. That was Manchester's moment in 1860 saying Black Lives Matter. That same term baffled me. When George Floyd happened, you're for the first time in our history and in over a century, everybody, probably not since World War II,
Majority of people
everybody in the world at that moment in 2020 was feeling the same feelings and going through the same daily routines, doing their work from home. Their outing was a walk or a bit of government sponsored exercise or provisioned exercise. The outings were to go shopping or food shopping. That was like a day out for a lot of people.
That's what it became, yeah.
That's what it became. Then George Floyd happens, and don't forget, coming back to the Forbes predictions, they already put the warnings out there. When the world sees that, that was a major moment of dissemination and attitude change towards injustice. That we can't have this, right? To the point that through the BLM and all the protests inside America and that specific story, which everyone in the world knows about now, that's like a Muhammad Ali moment. What do you have? The biggest, most racist tabloid head, Rupert Murdoch's platforms and Sky, Black Lives Matter on the corner of the TV screen. Not long ago, Pep Guardiola was fined for having a political symbol. Don't forget Mesut Ozil being completely silenced.
Yes.
When he came out with his defense of the Uyghur Muslims and all the rest of it. So to see that was a revolutionary symptom and moment to show that actually, that there is power in the numbers and the forces. To have Black Lives Matter on Sky Sports as a student of law and football contracts, I can't tell you how impossible that was. We used to joke and laugh at anything remotely reformist in that sector. And that's why I didn't appreciate footballers and didn't respect them. And I stopped having a footballer shirt on my back because really these guys are so censored, or they were up till that point. Then Marcus Rashford talks out with the free school meals and Boris does a U-turn, not once, not twice. A conservative government that literally will penny pinch and will try to cut every budget going has to create a budget because of the people power and the strength in numbers, which signifies and is symptomatic of that shift towards ethics and sustainability. And had we not been in that moment, all three things together, the motion was already there with Gen Z because they're thinking, my future. There's a selfish survival element of humans that no corporation will wash out. And the youth who always come up with new ideas for political systems. And those things happening at the same time has completely revolutionized the corporate world of governance. Now even governments are trying to, to cut the gap between them and the people because the power is in the people. And with all the knowledge now disseminating through all the platforms we have, I can see that we're more equipped than ever to deal with some of the challenges that we face, or all of the challenges that we face. So I'm optimistic for that reason alone. I thought that conceptualization basically says it all.
And it is probably the best way for us to actually end the podcast as well. Do you have any final remarks, any opinions or anything like that?
No, apart from...
where can people find you? Because I really do want you all to try and connect with Dr. Nouri, because, and I don't say this lightly, you are worth reaching out to and people talking to you, maybe, I don't know, doing their own podcast. Do you want to give some details about where you can be found?
Yeah, with pleasure. And you're very, very kind. And thank you. And it's always a pleasure to be on your platform. I always enjoy our conversations. So thank you for the opportunity. But yeah, on Twitter is probably the best way. I have my message box open at Bamo Nouri, BamoNouri.
I will put all your details in the description section of the videos and all that type of stuff. And obviously we'll post our pictures and stuff like that on Instagram. Bamo, thank you very much for coming on today. That was absolutely brilliant.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Like, subscribe, all the usual stuff. See you out next time.